group. People will usually pile in later on. So welcome everyone to the March edition of the WSBA ESG Working Group. Please keep in mind that this working group, like all of our working groups, are subject to both our confidentiality and antitrust policies. And please also remember that nothing discussed here should be considered accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice, because I have a lot of lawyers in my life. So with that being said, I will stop talking, turn it over to our chairs, Bibi and Suzanne. Let's give Amanda an opportunity before we kick off to say hello and introduce yourself to the group, and then we'll turn it over to Lucia. So Bibi, Suzanne, all yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. Bibi Rubio from PwC. Today I wanted to bring to the table I consider her well-rounded individual in this ecosystem, and the pleasure to know her is incredible. We met at Amplify at Money 2020, and once you hear Lucia, you are literally like immersed into her. But with that said, I wanted to take a moment to also acknowledge today is the beginning of Women's History Month. Woo-hoo! So, and on the 8th, we'll be celebrating International Women's History Month. So for those that will be having their own ERG events, you know, here's to all women. With that said, Lucia is the CEO of Emerge, which is an impact organization that helps she'll word it better than I could, but she helps other organizations fix what's wrong with their ESG programs. But so Lucia Gallardo, go ahead, introduce yourself. Suzanne, before she does that, do you have anything to add or?
I didn't know if we wanted to let Amanda introduce herself.
Yes,
just as a we don't always like shine the spotlight on new.
You are new, so
folks that join, but well, actually that's a lie. We do always shine the spotlight on a little bit, just because we're a smaller group and we're really fun and really like each other, and so we always just want to sort of get a chance to get to know anyone who's joining. If you don't mind saying a few words, and then, man, if I heard you right, you were with S&P, yes, and I'm wondering if you work with Natasha at all, or overlap with her, or
Natasha.
Yeah, Barrientos.
Yeah,
that's fine.
A bunch of Tashas in our group, but
yeah. Okay.
Barrientos, no. So I'm an attorney with MI Legal. So we're one of the divisions, and MI is one of the divisions, Market Intelligence. And so I run the Americas legal team for our division, and we have a wide range of like services, products, particularly now that we've acquired IHS Market. But sustainability has been something that across the board in our organization, we have developed products and are looking at the market, and so it comes up a lot, and I just want to sort of use this opportunity to learn more about ESG, particularly in the sort of blockchain cryptocurrency world, because I also support that. I have been here for 9 years, and I've always been in the IP tech space, and whether I was Waldachel or Colgate-Palmolive Company or with the Bloomberg administration. So like all things technology, all things sort of new, shiny, basically always attract me. And sustainability is definitely always new and shiny. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot from you guys.
Great.
Well, welcome. Thanks.
I want to give Raphael and Hector a quick intro for Lucia's benefit.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm Rafael Casas. I'm VP of Business Development here at Bitwave. Been in the, I guess, fintech industry for almost 20 years, working for Sage and Oracle and Microsoft. And so I'm, very passionate in those previous companies as well as here of, working in the ESG and DEI space. And, so this has been a really great working group, and I'm just proud to be a part of it. So thank you.
Hi, I'll keep mine brief. Hector Velez. I am on the legal working group with the WSBA, traditional markets background, mostly in derivatives, and most recently I was at Coinbase.
Okay, great.
Okay. The only other thing, Bibi, I'm just going to jump in and just mention to people really quickly, and then I'll be quiet. because I really can't wait to hear from Lucia. And is just to point out in our agenda that we sent out, we provided some links to some work that Cambridge University is doing and metrics they're gathering, and they're starting to just really try to quantify the E part of ESG as it relates to the crypto world. And, so just for your information, just make sure people are aware of that. And now I'll be quiet and listen.
Amazing. Well, it's so lovely to meet you all. Thank you for having me. I have a funny story, Hector, about Coinbase, because they did an event a few years ago when the whole Twitter thing blew up about them not wanting to have any activism at work. I was actually the last quote unquote activist guest speaker at Coinbase before that announcement went out. So it was right about the time of Hispanic Heritage Month. They brought me in to give a talk about impact and essentially gender and ethnic inequalities around the adoption of crypto across different global markets. And it was recorded. It went really, really well. There were definitely some things that were very bluntly stated. And then next thing I know, there's an implosion. And I had gotten this message from someone that was like, by the way, I sent your talk to Brian. And then, a few days later that happened. So all in all, that was a very fond memory of mine, because it's just coincidental that the whole thing exploded just after I came on. So I'll try to be, less maybe blunt this time around.
You're going to try not to explode WSBA.
Exactly.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
If we can minimize explosions on any given working group meeting, that would be deeply, deeply appreciated.
Fantastic.
Well,
Yeah.
the title is When ESG Doesn't Work. So let's go and explode that.
Oh, dear Lord. Back to you.
Yes. So for clarity, I've been working in the impact space for a really long time, but maybe I'll go backwards a little bit more. So when I was 19, I decided not to go to university and instead work for the public sector, because that's what I sort of thought I wanted to do my entire life. And I was a diplomat that specialized in international trade, especially around agriculture, and issues that related to identification. So we did a lot with undocumented immigration, with cross-border travel, documented immigration, special category visas, and sort of all things that now obviously translate to a lot in the digital ID space. And so I did that for a few years, and anyone that's ever worked in the public sector will know it, kills you slowly over time sometimes. And so 4 years later, I decided to start university, and I decided to go through the process of learning more about international economic development. And at the time, McGill had this really cool way of designing this program because you could create really niche specialization. And so my niche specialization was how to create economic development in places in the world that are either extremely poor and lack food and water security, or that have just gone through some kind of conflict, war or civil war, or something internal that has sort of displaced a lot of people and created a lot of chaos and lack of clarity in terms of, stability. And so started that, but very quickly started receiving job offers from the tech sector. And so I began my career in tech in 2015 in the categories of artificial intelligence and neurotechnology. Not for social impact. At the time, it was really more like consumer oriented. In AI, I was working as one of the first employees at Hopper, which was using predictive price modeling to try to help consumers sort of access travel and travel pricing in better ways. And then the other organization I was with was called NeuroTechX, which was trying to create community organizations that brought together like hardware and mechanical engineers, software engineers with neuroscientists in an effort to accelerate the rates of innovation within the neurotechnology sector. So I was a guinea pig for a few really cool pieces of tech. And also it's what kind of awakened this desire to learn more about technology. And in 2015, I was so in love with technology and the process of building. I had been on product teams. So I had sort of joined tech calls. I had no, technical calls I had no business being in. And I just tried to be a sponge as much as I could. And I kind of felt like I had a sense of FOMO for what other technology I had missed in like paying attention to other worldly things. And so came across blockchain for the first time that year. And it was probably one of those moments where you never really, you feel like you've awakened something that you can never turn off now. And for me, it was this combination of blockchain and artificial intelligence and the potential that it had specifically in emerging markets. So I spent 3 months researching 448 blockchain projects in 2015 and 16, all in emerging markets and all in different use cases, and spotted some very interesting trends that told you a lot about the economic development of certain regions of the world. For example, you could really see the level to which, for example, corruption in Latin America had influenced innovation, because a lot of the blockchain projects that were coming out of Latin America at the time were all about transparency and government accountability. Claros, which is, a very famous protocol for conflict resolution, it came out of Argentina. So it was a big obsession with, transparency and decision-making and governance. But then you had other markets, like Southeast Asia, that was looking at what to do with old infrastructure from their ICT economies, and they were trying to figure out how to modernize them for what was next. So they went full into financial services because they had so much banking infrastructure already and so many call centers that the combination of that labor force made it optimal to stay within the financial services industry. We had seen trends in Africa around renewable energy, because they're obviously housing the largest repository of renewable energy assets in the world, in the billions, and also in Eastern Europe, because they lacked, with certain exceptions, namely Russia, they lacked a lot of natural resources. They were focusing a lot on building their economies through like outsourced development and exchanges, and a lot around like gambling and online betting and things like that. So you could really see these like trends, and they were actually reflective of this like grander sociopolitical and socioeconomic context. And I think that that's really shaped who, I am and who, my company became, is to sort of bring that really holistic lens into the way that we view ESG and into the way that we view innovation and social innovation. And so in 2016, there was clearly no return. We participated in the Blockchain for Social Impact Hackathon, first ever, hosted by Consensus, came in second place. And then people were wondering what on earth we were planning on doing in this so-called industry of blockchain. I asked for 2 weeks to think about it and launched what Bibi has, just mentioned, Emerged. So my company, it's a lab. And we work with other companies, organizations, governments. We've worked with a little bit of everyone to bridge together their social innovation strategy. Maybe they don't have a social innovation, maybe they only have an impact goal, they might have a technology strategy, they might have a financialization strategy, but these are all usually very separate. And ESG kind of falls within its own department or its own separate initiatives. And so we've been working since 2016 with clients to merge all of these three elements together to build a monetizable impact innovation strategy for clients. And we also build products for them, services, little experiments that sort of set new precedents for how they can bring these into alignment together. So for example, some work that we've done in the public sector is that we've done a lot around digital identity, namely for displaced populations, for migration use cases, for legal identity and civil registry systems. We have worked with governments to create land titling and mapping for about 100 parishes or 13,000 farmers in rural Uganda. We've done work in the border in the US and Mexico with undocumented immigrants. We've consulted with the mayoral office in New York and in Austin on their homelessness and undocumented migration situations and digital identity. And we're currently the primary consultant to the United Nations Development Program on the applicability of blockchain towards civil registry systems and legal identity. And the private sector side is interesting because it's more recent. Initially, a lot of the private sector was kind of side interested, or maybe it was like more of a nice to have strategy. But today, we do a lot of work with private companies, blockchain companies, and Web2 or traditional companies that are looking to to become a lot more authentic and deeply rooted in ESG. And so we've worked with Hard Rock International, we've done some work with Juan Valdez, we've done some work with Hut 8, the mining company. We are doing some great work with some banks in Latin America, in the Middle East. We are doing work with cannabis companies in the Caribbean as well as in Europe, especially because it's a very sensitively regulated market in Europe. And we've done a lot of traceability in the agricultural sector as well. And so that's kind of, we have touched a lot of things. The commonalities here are that they are very impact focused, they're very technology forward, and that there's an undercurrent of understanding how to financialize this convergence. And so with that, I wanted to just kind of set some context into what we're seeing as, you know, this moment in time for ESG, and then open it up to questions. And so I think the best way to describe why maybe right now it's all the buzz and what we're hearing about is this idea that there's several critical things that are changing. One of the things that's changing is that we have historically seen, sorry, Ron, do you want to ask a question before I dig into this?
No, I'm sorry, Lucia, continue, please. I'll ask questions later on.
Okay. So what we've sort of historically seen is that ESG initiatives, corporate social responsibility, have always been considered more of a reputational risk for companies. Initially, if a company was doing any kind of harm, that was seen as a reputational risk. And there was a lot of, you know, trying to wash that away. There was a lot of crisis management, and there was a lot of sort of these initiatives that would be a band-aid solution or try to obscure the past, which, you know, very common use cases with, you know, Nike and their labor issues and, you know, oil spills and all of these kinds of things that sort of happened because organizations were very worried about the reputational risk that these kinds of topics sort of brought out in people. Recently, Naveen conducted a study of institutional investors in Europe and North America, and it was the first time ever that the majority of institutional investors, over 50% of them, stated that they believe that the current fundamentals of long-term market dynamics are no longer relevant because issues like social inequality and climate risk specifically are both no longer reputational risk, but actually strategic risk. And over 80% of institutional investors believe that their investment choices and that the way that they understand new market dynamics are influenced by both of these factors, and that their decisions influence both of these factors. So it's a two-way street. And it was the first time this ever happened. It's a very interesting precedent to understand how, like, the financial sector is really viewing what is valuable to invest in and what needs to change in order for us to understand, you know, where things like social inequality and climate change influence fluctuation in commodity prices, how, for example, the fluctuation of pricing in extraction and mass production influence, you know, bottom lines and influence innovation and influence supply chain dynamics as well. And we're sort of seeing a fair bit of conflict and exacerbated inequities in a lot of industries that have an availability of natural resources that is concentrated in certain ways. And so because of this, it's hard to predict where exactly we're seeing, you know, the future of financial markets and industries and national and international policy, you know, come together on issues that relate to impact. But what we do know is that there's enough contextually changing in these contexts that, you know, it's no longer enough to, you know, have a nice to have strategy, but it's actually a critical element of strategy that needs to be carefully embedded into long-term viability plans for organizations. There's a second thing that's super important, and it's changing at the same time as grander factors. And that is that we're seeing what is the biggest wealth transfer in human history. Over $70 trillion are going to be passed down from baby boomers to millennials and Gen Z in the next 30 years. It is an exorbitant amount of money coming into the hands of two generations that are incredibly vocal about how and where they want to spend their money, about whom they want to give their money and allocate their money to. And this is, you know, as consumers, but also as investors. We're really seeing, for example, family offices, sort of an inherited wealth, start paying critical attention to investment portfolios and how they could be investing in climate forward or impact forward investment strategies and thesis. Few interesting statistics to keep in mind about the new consumer is that 64% of Gen Z consumers are willing to pay more for sustainable products. And Consumer Insights has actually found that even though they're facing the greatest level of inflation in history, and that wages are not going up, but that cost of living is going up, millennials and Gen Z in some product categories are actually willing to spend 4 times the original price if they can trust that the product is actually coming from an ethical or sustainable source. It is an insane price differential of what they're willing to pay for something that they feel makes them feel good about the way they interact with the world. Products that are, environmentally and socially responsible have seen a 28% cumulative growth in sales in the past 5 years because of the way that money is trickling down into newer generations. And about 76% of consumers have decided that they are willing to discontinue a relationship if they feel a company is operating poorly in the categories of environment, employee sort of welfare and well-being, and like community impact. And so with that, we sort of understand that sustainability and ethics have become a top 5 value driver for how companies choose to spend their money. And it becomes a real opportunity, not just in the physical space and in the physical realm, but also in the digital realm, especially within an industry like blockchain or a sector or a space or whatever we want to define it as, within blockchain that is sort of banking on or predicated upon pillars, philosophical pillars of inclusion, of impact, and of change that is inherently supposed to be part of the core mission. And so this trust element around how new consumers feel about the way blockchain companies operate specifically is going to continue to increase as a critical factor in the decision-making of mass adoption. So what does that mean, really? It puts us in a really interesting moment for ESG, right? Because one, enough of the cultural and like grander landscape is changing, consumers are changing, and regulatory policy is obviously something that is reactive to all of these factors, right? And so just within the past, year and a half or so, we've seen an incredible rise in mandatory sustainability reporting, in understanding where weaknesses in evaluation and monitoring are across the ESG space. And also we're starting to see a lot of effort channeled into creating international standards for sustainability or for other kinds of impact that is ultimately leading into a set of rules and requirements that companies need to abide by. And in the case of the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is the new policy that is it's effective, basically already in some cases, in some parts of the policy. Essentially, what we're trying to achieve here is A, greater transparency, but B, greater coverage around the world. So in the case of the EU, any company that operates any kind of office in Europe is also required to conduct this reporting. So just having any kind of presence in Europe already likely makes you automatically eligible or mandated to report, and also eligible to claim certain types of societal impacts that could greatly benefit your company, or that could essentially provide opportunities to reduce double materiality and to also create tap into some of the newer initiative subsidies, grant programs, regulatory sandboxes, and exceptions that the EU has been pushing thus far. For example, they just did announce a regulatory sandbox for companies that are in the blockchain space, digital asset space. There are a few key categories that they're interested in particularly pursuing. And these companies, about half of the categories that are listed on it relate to some kind of ESG-centric lens. And so that they're prioritizing it, and that ultimately they're going to be choosing 20 companies in their next cohort to provide regulatory exemptions to. And we know that the majority of those will have at least some degree of ESG-centric lens, because that's what the EU has chosen to prioritize. And that kind of the combination of these 3 elements of, greater landscape, changing consumer, and regulatory changes really make it like a moment for us to understand, you know, the intentionality that is required to tackle ESG properly in this kind of climate. It's really no longer a reputational thing. It's not a CSR centric thing. It's not a separate initiative type of thing. It's not a passive outcome type of thing. And what we're really seeing is exactly that. So when does ESG not work? It doesn't work most of the time now, right? Because a lot of it is so focused on, you know, mitigating or neutralizing impacts in, you know, making your environmental strategy carbon offsetting, which is ridiculous. Because it's ultimately not really leading to any reduction in carbon. It's not having any meaningful physical impact in the degree to which we can address our carbon problems and our greenhouse gas emission problems. And basically it's throwing, you know, money at a physics problem, right? And so it's not working. And so as we sort of see people understand that there's so much opportunity within ESG, and their immediate thought is to stay structured in these like boxes of offsetting carbon, neutralizing negative impacts, and, you know, using these like boxed historical, almost like dinosaur age CSR initiatives and programs. These narratives don't work anymore. They're not enough anymore. And actually, we've seen the market bite back at these kinds of things. We saw, for example, during the pandemic, when, you know, BLM became a matter of international concern, we saw social media sort of receive huge amounts of traffic from brands and companies that were, you know, putting on black squares or making commentary on the issue. And then you would open up the comments and you would see younger consumers saying, since when have you ever cared about racial inequality? What, you know, I worked for your company and I felt discriminated against, or, you know, we've been following your company forever and this has never been an issue for you that you've cared about. And so it becomes really important that as an enterprise that's thinking about how to tackle ESG with intention and how to do it in a way that builds future proofing for the new landscape that we're sort of starting to see, and it's just the beginning, that we shift away from these broad approaches and these like neutralizing negative impact approaches, and we start challenging a lot of unquestioned assumptions around how these negative impacts even come to be and what we're actively doing, not just to neutralize them, but to proactively reduce them. We need to really understand, you know, critical issues like digital waste. You know, blockchains can do a lot in adding transparency and traceability, but they also create massive amounts of digital waste. Today, we're capturing approximately 2.5 quintillion bytes of data per day. It is an exorbitant amount. And every day, the energy that is required in order to store this data, much of which is duplicate data, irrelevant data, data that already has become obsolete, even within the NFT space, for example, you have so many digital assets and collections that have been rendered completely valueless, and they're still sitting there being stored and consuming resources, consuming energy, but providing no real value back into the ecosystem or into the world. And so this concept of digital waste, data recycling, understanding, you know, what the true holistic footprint of the blockchain is, not just in the sense of the traceability element and the consensus mechanism, but also in understanding what the vertical stack is in terms of, you know, cloud and what is the energetic efficiency of that. Actually, most people might not realize that within the NFT space alone, the actual most environmentally damaging part of this is rendering artwork. So a typical, let's say 30K three-dimensional NFT project will emit about 48.6 tons of carbon into the atmosphere. Like a singular collection has the potential to render that footprint, right? And so unless we are literally tracing and challenging these assumptions that just because the consensus mechanism is friendlier toward the environment, that the project has a mitigated impact, we really need to start thinking beyond and paying attention to some of these critical issues around energy efficiency across the entire supply chain and vertical tech stack, and across issues like digital waste and data recycling. And then use that to sort of uncover strategic blind spots for how our organizations can do better and can create first mover advantage or competitive advantage by, you know, paying greater attention to where ESG falls in from a strategic standpoint that is deeper than a side initiative or nice to have. And so when thoughtfully designed, merged strategies of sustainable development and ESG objectives, innovation strategies, and financial viability and monetization models can really create a profitable, viable, and future-proofed approach toward ESG. And, that might mean creating a new financial instrument and deploying it into the market. It might mean tapping into an environmental assets market like biodiversity credits, carbon credits, plastic recovery credits, but then ensuring that if we are going to be entering those kind of credit markets for environmental assets, that we've taken on a mitigation strategy first, because the more that we mitigate first, the more we can even, participate in these kinds of environmental markets in the first place. And so ultimately, this like experimentation mindset is what is hopefully going to build more of an evolving economic system that is much more tethered to value dynamics that are positively correlated with ESG objectives, as opposed to sort of measuring everything in fiat or, and traditional money dynamics and capitalistic dynamics, and not ultimately having the type of impact that is necessary in order for us to address the changes that we need to see in order for us to address the issues that are pressing us around the world. And so I think that's kind of what I wanted to get out as a contextualizer, and then sort of open it up for questions. And that could be about, what the work that we've done or examples of projects. It could be about your own organizations and what you're thinking through, general questions on tendencies, or, anything else you might want to discuss. I'm pretty open about everything.
Hey, Lucia, Suzanne, I'm going to chime in if I could. And Suzanne and Bibi know me long enough to know I always have a lot of questions. I want to ask, and that's a great contextual background. I'm really grateful for it. And thank you so much. I want to ask how you address what I almost consider to be the philosophic challenges around the ESG discussion. And what I mean by that is I have colleagues across a lot of different industries who will tell me, I run XYZ Corporation. XYZ Corporation's mission is to sell widgets and, return value to our shareholders. How do you answer that? How do you answer that conversation around that's not our mission? And we can all look at social inequality and we look at, degradation of the environment as things that need to be solved. Why is it important for private industry to be part of that conversation?
That's a great question. I think at the end of the day, like philosophically speaking, I think no one has like such a niche mission that they're product focused, right? And if they are, that's a strategic risk in and of itself, because tech continuously gets better. It's changing. Like I'm already outdated today from whatever happened yesterday. And so because of that, it's super important for organizations to have flexible enough mission that they can foresee what is coming next. And it's very clear that there is enough coming together that we can see that what is coming next is an incredible demand for organizations to work in harmony with, better dynamics in terms of being less consumptive, less extractive, and a lot more value and regeneration driven. An example of this, we had a client come in once, they make buoys, like the floating, they make buoys.
Yeah.
And so they came to us and they said, hey, we make buoys, and we are hearing about all this, like, ESG, whatever, we operate in Europe. We're going to have to, report on stuff. And we have no idea what we're doing in this element, but, we make buoys and we make smart ones. So essentially they, retrofit their buoys with an NFC chip, and then the way that they operate is, instead of a boat having to drop its anchor every time it needs to park, they are strategically placed. They drop an anchor once, and then essentially boats come in and park essentially by connecting to the buoy with a stainless steel hook. So instead of needing to drop their anchor every single time and lift it back up, they just come, they park, the NFC scanner sort of checks their license and that everything's sort of, in control, and charges them a small fee for essentially parking. So that's what they do. And so they were very keen on exploring, what is it within the impact space that we can tap into. And that to me was like such a fun call, because there's so much that can be done there. And so they, one of the most damaging things to oceanic ecosystems is anchors, like dropping them and raising them back up. They drag and they like in many cases permanently destroy the biodiversity that's underneath. And it's something that we struggle to monitor because we don't have a lot of visibility into what's going on in oceanic floors. And so essentially what we sort of came up with as a strategy was like multiple fold, but we decided to integrate more sensors into the buoy so that we could start measuring certain conditions around biodiversity regrowth, because we realized that because they have a permanent anchor, if you surround that anchor that's, permanently put in with material that fosters the regrowth of like marine life, that you are essentially regrowing biodiversity, which makes you qualify as being a recipient of, biodiversity credit funds. And so they can now tap into that. Additionally, oceans are actually one of the most effective carbon sequesters on the planet. So if you start monitoring things around carbon sequestration, you can also tap into carbon credit markets. Additionally, any data on like biodiversity regrowth and anything we can capture in terms of the environmental footprint of this is actually something that is worth a lot, because there's no real clarity on this kind of data. And a lot of people, think tanks and researchers and universities, et cetera, would pay to have this kind of data that is captured in near real time or in real time on a regular basis. And so we started building a strategy from there. And suddenly they had a business model that was all around like parking. And we had introduced them to an entire strategy of, repeated monetization over a couple of adaptations to their strategy that ultimately also gave them a very powerful narrative as, a byproduct of the work that they were doing. We added a couple other things that were interesting too, because of, the opportunity to install like mangroves. And we had like a bunch of strategies around it. It's a tiered project. So we're starting mostly with what's happening underneath the water. But it's one of those things where, a company will come to us and say, this is what we do. And the follow-up question is really like, why do you even care about that? And, what else do you care about? And where do all of these things come into play? And when you're thinking about, from a strategy and future-proofing standpoint, then understanding where there's opportunity to commercialize, to profit and to build in viability that addresses some of this changing landscape in a financially, healthy way, then it kind of makes it almost like nonsensical that you would want to do that, right? And I think that's really the philosophical change that needs to happen for people to understand ESG for what it's intended to be, which is this idea that the value dynamics that we currently operate on are largely consumptive and extractive. And when people box their thinking, that's usually what they end up thinking about. So they'll say, our answer to ESG right now is to participate in more, consumptive markets by purchasing offsets. That's kind of like the only pathway for a lot of people. But once you like challenge those assumptions that those are really like the only ways that you can tether profitability and value dynamics to success, then that's when it becomes like a really compelling approach for any kind of business leader to factor it into their strategy.
Thank you, Lucia. I think
Go ahead,
Suzanne's got a
Suzanne.
question.
Yeah.
It's still on mute. There you go.
Thank you. The tech aardvark over here. So this is all so interesting and wonderful. I could just listen to you talk and not want to even bother
All
with
day, right?
Oh yeah. So I'm going to pivot in my question to the these new kind of financial reporting requirements, and because that's my background, and so I've been doing some reading and following, and I used to work at the International Accounting Standards Board, which now has stood up the International Sustainability Standards Board. And one of the things, I guess where I'm going with this is what do you think about the standards that are coming out? And I know it's like a two-pronged question, because one is the EU's approach, which includes double materiality, and the ISSB's approach, which is a pretty much almost single materiality. Just what does this do to your financial statements? Sort of measurement of what's important. Whereas the EU tried to say, it's not just about what this all does to your financial statements, it's about your impact as well. And so there's these two approaches. The ISSB is attached to this such a globally famous organization that it stands a chance of dominating then the story and the metrics that come out, and they'll be the ones that are not double materiality. And so many people have concerns about that, and I just don't know if you had a chance to think about it, or if you and no worries if you don't, but just what your thoughts are. The EU seems to have, by many people's estimation, done a better job, but they often play, they often get overshadowed by the International Accounting Standards folks.
Yeah.
So.
I think PR-wise, international accounting standards are having a bit of a moment. So I think that it is a perfect time for the EU to kind of like sweep in. I think, you need the outcome data. You really need the outcome data. And this is where I think that the precedent of collecting that outcome data becomes extra compelling for possibilities of what comes next, right? So I'm going to give you an example. It's one of our projects is called The Eternals. It is an NFT collection with the intention of tethering impact outcomes to the value of the financial instrument. So essentially what ends up happening is when you first acquire the NFT, it's a baby rainforest. And so the flowers are unblossomed, the trees are seedlings, it's a baby plot, little grass. And as you do certain actions that contribute to rainforest protection as a cause, the NFT itself starts to blossom, grow, etc. And so there's a couple of factors here. Number one is that essentially when you try to resell that financial instrument, you can do it at different stages. So if you purchase it immediately and you immediately flip it, then it'll be very close to the floor price, I'm sure. But if you decide to take the time to grow your plot and then sell it when it has greater benefits and more, visual complexity and artful complexity, then the value of that is also has changed, right? And it's in theory worth more. Additionally, there's a few passive things that contribute to everybody's growth. So when the nonprofit that we're funding, because we're donating 55% of the proceeds of this project to a rainforest protection organization. So when they meet targets, which are evaluated twice a year, everybody's plot sort of grows a little and it rains for everyone. And so once you start looking at, okay, how do we connect this data? That becomes a very compelling use for future opportunities for monetization. There's also another question that I think, we're about to, this is under embargo in theory, but, I'm happy to sort of discuss the principles of it. One of our newest initiatives, which we're going to be publicly launching probably in about 2 months, is an approach that is taking ecological assets and assigning them a return on impact investment. And so essentially right now, let's say, you have some kind of national debt, you're, Ecuador or Cape Verde, you're a country that has, large amounts of density in terms of ecological asset, but you also happen to have a lot of foreign loans. And so today, in theory, that loan, you have to pay back the foreign loan, or the creditor might tell you, okay, we'll condone this debt if you invest the equivalent into some kind of environmental trust or asset. And so fine, but what does that mean? It means that in theory, the structure of the loan hasn't changed. You're still paying a creditor. It's just this time the creditor is an environmental trust. But that hasn't created any kind of value dynamic where the actual outcomes of protecting those assets and the outcomes of that investment in protecting those assets, that hasn't rendered any kind of value back. So the dynamic remains the same, where it's an expenditure for the host, for the in-debt country. It's just they're directing the investment differently, but the success of their investments has no bearing on, the financial dynamics that are happening here. And so when you start to sort of think about where impact outcomes play a role, it's not just about saying, hey, you're doing this successfully or not. It's really about the precedent that it's setting and being able to then understand, how do you create a value dynamic around impact outcomes? How do you then reinsert that value into the market? And then what opportunities does that create for a company to create derivative models for future financial viability that are centered around, the success that they're having across their impact outcomes? So I think that's why it's so valuable. Like, to me, it's really not just about the reporting of success metrics or failure metrics. It's really like the precedent that it's going to set in terms of data and the opportunity to then think very imaginatively about how to reinsert success outcomes into the economy. And that kind of philosophical approach to ecological value, I think, is really going to make a bigger difference in success outcomes in the future than continuing on like very traditional financialization market dynamics.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Any other open questions for Lucia?
Yeah,
yes, Ron.
Yeah, Bibi, I've got a lot of questions. Lucia, I'm old enough to remember Kyoto Protocol, and which seemed a good idea at the time, which was around trading of carbon reduction credits on the basis that if you're optimizing and you're reducing your emissions, you get allotted more credits. If you're not, you have to buy those credits to compensate, and over time, governments would raise the requirement. So ultimately, it would be too expensive not to engage in climate emission reduction. But you said something interesting, and you mentioned that carbon offsetting and by extension, the carbon trading market is kind of ridiculous. It doesn't work. Why? What are your thoughts there? And the reason I say that is, and the reason I ask that is, in my mind, blockchain and crypto assets, or at least tokenization, might be an opportunity to evolve that.
Maybe. A lot of the problems around carbon markets are not necessarily the traceability of data, but the original auditing, like the original auditing and capturing of data. It's really, really hard to assess this, like in most cases, it's really hard to really measure what the carbon reduction actually is, like how much is being sequestered or removed, like the actual metrics around what is that project actually accomplishing. That's really hard. And so ultimately what you have right now is, marketplaces that are saying we're going to add more transparency to, this process, but actually blockchain is not really the primary problem in addressing this. It's almost like an IoT issue to solve. Like what is the data capture process? What data is coming into this? How is that data correlated? And then how do you paint a picture of the true effectiveness of a carbon project, and then creating the auditability chain of custody around that? So once it's properly audited, then, blockchain plays a very key role in creating greater transparency around pricing, creating greater transparency around trust, and creating greater transparency around dynamics and availability of credits across different marketplaces. So I think in general, it can address a lot of issues, but the primary issue, which is a trust and auditability problem, is not really something that can be solved via blockchain, but it can be addressed by complementary technologies, which can then maybe directly connect to a blockchain and then add to the element of auditability after that. So, the reason why they don't largely work is this: it's very hard to measure success. There's a lot of volatility in terms of price and availability. And there's a lot of fragmentation in how many marketplace and how saturated the market is. There's, questionable outcomes in terms of what's being invested in and what those outcomes are sort of leading toward. So I think, there's huge monopolization of existing standards. Obviously, the Guardian's gone on like a vengeful path of against Vera, but it's an industry-wide problem because it's a highly monopolized ecosystem between Vera and the gold standard, right? So really looking at how we audit this, how do we collect the data to make projects, auditable in much more meaningful ways, and then how we create the transparency and trust around that. Yes, blockchain plays a role. AI will play a role in analyzing perhaps some of the pricing data, also some of the cross posting of projects or things like that across different marketplaces. You can sort of avoid certain issues around trust and transparency. But as a whole, I think the approach is not yet solved. And looking at it as a monolithic thing that it's a data transparency problem is probably not the answer, which is why I think I'm very not excited about a lot of the approaches in what is currently a supremely saturated market, even within the Web3 carbon economy, right? Like it's already a saturated market. And if I hear one more proposal for a carbon marketplace, I might die because they're literally—
Wait, I've got my carbon marketplace here. No, I'm kidding. Totally
all
kidding.
Different. They're all different, and yet they're all not different. And so, so I think it's there's a lot broken in there. Obviously there's been a lot of progress that's been done. Obviously, having some data is better than having more obscure data. So there's definitely steps forward. But I think in terms of impact outcomes, this is not the highest return for effort into successfully addressing the carbon problem. I also think there's still not enough incentives for people to actively take on aggressive carbon reduction strategies. And so, I can tell you right now that when we found out that a 30K NFT collection 3D rendered will produce 68.4, I think that's what it is, 64.8 tons, 64.6 tons of carbon. That to us was shocking, completely unacceptable. But then the question was, how do we reduce it? We took on really aggressive strategies and we brought that number down to 6.9 tons of carbon. But that was not easy. It was expensive, it was intentional, and it took a year it took 7 months longer than we anticipated building this project to actually execute on that strategy. The outcome, obviously incredible. We reduced 90% of our carbon, emissions. Additionally, we shaved off an extra 16.88 tons of carbon from, what we ended up doing with some of the water that we used to, recycle. We recycled essentially the computing power's heat, and then we turned it into a heat source for water. And then we donated that water to public hospitals and social housing units across France. So 48 social housing units and 1 public hospital. We donated about 4 million liters to all of them. And so we ended up taking off 16.88 tons of carbon from what they would have used had they, used fossil fuel-based electricity to heat that water instead of our energy, right? But ultimately, that was a very big experiment, and it was a very conscious decision. And so I think, by having focus on, we'll become carbon neutral by offsetting our footprint, that would have been a huge mistake on our part. And I'm really proud of the fact that we didn't go that route, but it's definitely the simplest and most obvious route to take. And unfortunately, it's so available to take today that it's becoming the default answer is, neutralizing impact as opposed to genuinely, reducing negative impacts. And that's, I think, where we're sort of allowing this conversation on offsets to overtake the possibilities and the innovation, true innovation in what could be possible around carbon and Web3.
Go ahead, Bibi. Sorry.
No, I know that you were recently in Davos. You went, right? Yeah. And I was wondering what was, we do Davos, they do Davos every year. They talk about ESG and the changing landscape and all the reporting. What was the common, did you feel that anything that they do to go to this event that was resolved, or is anywhere close to, meeting any of those expectations in net zero carbon footprint?
I think this is an interesting question because I have very particular feelings about being in the room. To me, if you have an opportunity to be in the room, you're always in the room. And I think that as sort of, we meet this moment of opportunity for ESG. I think if you don't have an ESG person in the decision-making room between a CEO, a COO, CFO, and you better have your ESG human in the room as well. I think they've become an equally important part of the decision-making process. I think what Davos does well is it creates incredible serendipity. And so is it a place where things get done? No, absolutely not. Is it a place where conversations are sparked randomly that then enable things to be followed up with and done? Absolutely. In fact, this project, the macroeconomic, debt project, it was born in Davos. Okay. And so it was a conversation with, someone that we'd sort of been in orbiting spheres. We were both founding members of the Crypto Sustainability Coalition at the World Economic Forum. And so we'd run into each other a little bit, but having that sort of moment of serendipity and saying, we both really care about this issue, let's work on it. That is something that does take place in Davos. And so is it a place where, it feels optimistic? Absolutely, because people are there intentionally to sort of figure out how, they fall into this grander debate on climate. But I don't think I would say that work gets done there necessarily.
Okay.
I've got one more for you, Lucia, and I realize we could go on for 2 more hours. You said something interesting, and I want to pick up on that a little bit. And I don't mean this to be as provocative as it's going to sound, but I realize the energy impact of the NFT example that you made, and I think that's really critically important. One of the conversations we often hear is the ESG movement kind of nibbling at the edges of the real problem? And by way of example, I'm going to compare the NFT issue to factory farmed meat production, which if you cut into that a little bit, would dramatically lower emissions worldwide. So why is that such a challenge? And what are your thoughts about, not necessarily saying everyone should be a vegetarian, might be nice, but what are your thoughts about the best way to approach that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a flexitarian, so I try to spread my negative impact across all categories. And so So I think I would say that that is something that I probably extend into this ecosystem. I think it's also not necessarily always a bad conversation. I think, obviously blockchain gets such a bad rap for its energy, its lack of energy efficiency, or its consumption. And consumption is such a one-toned conversation, because if you start looking more deeply into the actual sourcing, for example, of energy, the two, like right now, HUD 8 and USBTC merged, and together they form a block of one of the largest mining blocks, in the world for Bitcoin. And if you look at their power mix, it's largely nuclear, hydroelectric, solar. They're like wind. They're using wind, so they're really big on renewable energy. And if you looked at the CoinShares study on the power mixes for blockchains, Ethereum, and even when it was proof of work, and Bitcoin were both using well over 50%, from a renewable power source. And so that tells you that even without any government subsidy, any kind of taxpayer incentive, funded incentives, that there is an innate desire from our sector to meet certain objectives around climate. And that's a really important conversation to have, because it costs less to the taxpayer to support a financial ecosystem that is developed and built with these founding principles innately embedded into our philosophy. Now, at the same time, we're clearly not doing well enough, but if you take the aggregate of the traditional finance sector, if you're looking at, ATMs, if you're looking at bank branches, if you're looking at, the entire footprint of, creating a bank branch and building it from scratch and operating it daily, if you're looking at digital banking and that footprint, then you start to sort of see that for a huge footprint, we are cementing a traditional finance sector that isn't by nature inclusive, because so much of the world cannot, access it. And there's policy that is specifically exclusive toward, over 1.4 billion people today that will never be able to pass KYC AML. So you have this like giant footprint that is really solidifying financial exclusion in many ways. And then you've got a significantly large, percentage of consumption and energetic, questions for a financial ecosystem that is intended to fragmentalize a financial system so that it is by nature inclusive. So, energy is going to be consumed. Everything consumes energy. This conversation we're having today is consuming. And so is the question is not whether, we stop consumption or whether we block it or whether we inhibit it in some way, but really to understand what is the outcome of this expenditure, and is that outcome worth what it's currently at, and how much do you then invest and encourage people to reduce that and make it much more efficient, but we channel our attention and energy into that, as opposed to preserving legacy systems that ultimately consume huge amounts of resources but maintain that sort of dynamic that is exclusive by default. And so I think like when I'm asked this kind of question around how do we meet this moment around the conversations around energy, the conversations around consumption, and the conversations about maintaining these kinds of digital economy systems, I sort of say, what's the trade-off? The trade-off is you build economies that are highly inclusive. And at the end of the day, sustainability is not environmentalism. Sustainability is not just about environmentalism. It's also about social, well-being. And a huge element of social well-being is economic participation and opportunity to create economic wealth and growth and stability. And so it's kind of like where I come at it from that sort of lens. And then to me, it just becomes something that makes me really proud of saying that I work in blockchain, is that this is something that is innately embedded into our culture.
That is a great way to end. Thank you, Lucia.
Any last comments, BB, from Raphael or Cindy at all, or Suzanne?
Yes.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
So, is it too late to ask a question?
No, not
I'm
at
just
all.
wondering, what is the tipping point? There are a lot of initiative and things going on, whether it's from Gen Z, or is it from legal regulatory, or is it from, I don't know, grassroots efforts? Just curious what the tipping point that you can see.
Yeah, I think for me, it is like the convergence of all of that, right? Like it's literally the timing of it is what the tipping point, because we've had one or other of these pressures before. We've had, a very rebellious generation in the 60s and 70s that was, advocating for certain things. We have had moments in time where policy has sort of created some kind of a fundamental shift in the way that we view things. Let's say privacy is a good example of that. We have seen, each of these independently happen and has created kind of a resurgence. But I feel like this is interesting timing, specifically because they're all aligning and they're all coming together in a particular moment in time where the world is highly financialized. So even though we had obviously international economics and we had globalized commerce and things like that available to us before, the degree to which things are financialized today, I think is a very interesting precedent. The fact that we can actively say, everything is in some way, shape, or form now participating to some degree in financialization, whether it's loyalty programs, whether it's art and assets, whether it is creation and value creation, everything is sort of entering the space of being able to be commodified, your data, your digital identity, everything. And so because of that, and the fact that money is really at the core of what's going on in the way we interact in the world today, the fact that all of these things are coming together and there is a technology that sort of touches everything, every aspect of that through financialization, I think that's the unprecedented moment for me. And so ultimately, I think once companies start to realize the opportunity that lies inherently within the financialization of these things converging, I think that's the real tipping point in terms of execution. But I think we've met it, in terms of what's changed and what is necessary, we've arrived. I think the timing right now is really optimal.
Now.
Obviously, I'm biased because I'm sunken in it, but I think this is the kind of the tipping point we've been waiting for. It's all of these things to align. And then for us to understand that because the world is so financialized that we require sort of a shifting attitude in how those value dynamics then translate into meeting this moment.
Great.
That's all
Thank
the
you so
time
much.
that's all the time. Thank you, Cindy. Lucia, thank you so much. That's all the time we've got. We'll make the recording available. I hope you'll come back. It's always a fascinating conversation. I hope you'll spend a little bit more time with the folks at the WSBA. There are other working groups that would love to hear some of your perspectives as well. But Suzanne, Bibi, thank you for arranging this. We'll leave
Thank
it
you,
there.
Lucia.
Everyone have a great rest
Feel
of
free
the
to
day.
share my contact information, LinkedIn, email. Very happy to answer questions to, whatever, just feel free to reach out.
Will do. And we're hoping
Thank
to have
you.
you back again. Thank you so much, Lucia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Have a great
And
day.
then maybe I will send over an offer so that when you do release the recording, that members can claim some kind of offer for, benefit.
Advisory.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Lucia.
We will
Awesome.
put it on our newsletter.
Bye-bye.
We'll
Perfect.
work on it.